Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, y'all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would talk about this little video and the subject that I found to be very particularly interesting. And this is going to be a video that I'm going to review by FightHype.com. It's not going to be that long of a video, but I just thought that it was very particularly interesting. But with Fight Hype, I always kind of like their videos because whenever I do review their videos and I think it's one worth reviewing or worth talking about, they always either have a former champion, such as Paulie Malignaggi here, that's going to be talking about this situation or this subject, such as the David Benavidez versus David Morrell fight, which will be transpiring today. We'll have to see what ends up happening there. But anyways, Paulie Malignaggi, just to talk about him very quickly, of course, for those of you that did not end up following his boxing career, Paulie Malignaggi was a guy that was a legitimate two-weight division champion. He was a guy that, of course, was very flawed as a fighter. I don't think that he was ever super defensively, responsible. His stance was a little bit too wide, in my personal view. And of course, Paulie Malignaggi, for any multiple weight division champion, he might have the least amount of effective punching power out of any other multi-divisional champion in any other, out of any other multi-divisional champion in boxing history. But Paulie Malignaggi, in my view, he still made his effect somewhat within boxing history, or at least had a very decent boxing career compared to most. But Paulie Malignaggi, not only has he, had somewhat of an illustrious boxing career, at least to a degree, but of course, one would debate that he's been a little bit more popular as a commentator than what he was really as a professional fighter or a boxing analyzer. And Paulie Malignaggi to me is kind of a mixed bag. There's a lot of the times where he says certain things where I agree with him, but there's also certain times, kind of like with certain commentators, you can tell that he may have a particular axe to grind with that opponent or a particular axe to grind with that person. One of those fighters, of course, for a long time was Manny Pacquiao because he thought that he was a steroid cheat. One of those fighters being Devin the Dream Haney because Devin Haney, of course, said that thing about Lomachenko, saying that he would never let a white boy beat him. And of course, another one of these fighters would be that of Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez. And when it comes to Saul Canelo Alvarez, you got to be careful with about 5 different people that talk about Canelo Alvarez because it's pretty much going to be complete haterade. You got to watch out for Paulie Malignaggi. You got to watch out for Teddy Atlas. You got to watch out for Dante's Boxing Nation. You got to watch out for Aki TV. And you got to watch out for Juan Manuel Marquez. Those 5 guys hate Canelo Alvarez's guts for whatever particular reason, but they probably believe that he's gotten a little bit more credit than what he's actually deserved. And I thought that I would kind of talk about this because growing up in the Canelo Alvarez era, I remember when I used to watch Canelo Alvarez growing up. And I remember first watching the first pay-per-view fight of his, I believe, against Arislani Lara. And first impressions, oftentimes, they do last a lifetime. And it took me a very long time to actually respect Canelo Alvarez's skill set as a fighter. And when I was younger in my teenage years growing up in the 2010s, watching the fighters such as Canelo Alvarez, I thought that Canelo Alvarez was a super overrated fighter. I thought that at the time that when I had watched that fight that he had gotten a gift decision over Arislani Lara. I thought that, of course, that he got dominated over Floyd Mayweather Jr. Of course, there was the Miguel Cotto fight, where I was really hoping that Cotto, who was my favorite fighter of that particular generation or somewhat of the 2000s, I was really hoping that Cotto was going to beat that of Canelo Alvarez. Of course, it did not transpire. Canelo Alvarez was able to get a unanimous decision over Miguel Cotto. And then, of course, later on in the first Gennady Golovkin fight, Canelo Alvarez ended up getting a draw over Gennady Golovkin in a fight that I think most people would probably agree on that Gennady Golovkin probably deserved to just edge it. But the thing is about Canelo Alvarez is that, in my personal view, especially once I ended up growing up more within my logical stage, I realized that Canelo Alvarez, especially with what he was able to accomplish, and especially once he really gave Gennady Triple G Golovkin a tough fight in the rematch, I started to realize how great of a fighter Canelo Alvarez actually was. And when you start to really grow into more of a logical state of mind and more of adulthood and, really more, less of a childlike mind state, and don't look at fighters in a fanboyish state and all that other stuff, you really start to look at things as a little bit more logically. And the thing is that when you talk about some of these guys, about Canelo Alvarez, especially Paulie Malignaggi and Teddy Atlas, when they talk about Canelo, you have to be very careful the way that they talk about Canelo. Because many of the points that they bring up on the surface, or they can bring up several points, and they all somewhat sound logical, somewhat on the surface. But a lot of those points will be mainly to be used to try and discredit Canelo Alvarez as an all-time grade level fighter. Now, I'm not necessarily sure why their particular motivations would be, or why they would try to discredit Canelo Alvarez to such a degree as an all-around great fighter. But what you notice a lot of the times, what people love to do, especially with certain fighters, is that in order, for their certain idols of the past, in order for them not to be surpassed, they love to do this thing to where they love to create these insurmountable odds or these standards that are pretty much impossible to achieve, or that their former idols or that their favorite fighters did not achieve. And they say, for example, that, well, if Canelo Alvarez is to become the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, like Teddy Atlas said, sure, I would say that Canelo is clearly the greatest Mexican fighter of all time if he beats David Benavidez, Dimitri Bivol, and Artur Beterbiev, or at least David Benavidez and Dimitri Bivol. And I understand to a degree where Teddy Atlas is coming from, but at the same time, if I also take a look at it, and if we really want to take a look at Canelo Alvarez's career, and if we want to take a look at debatably who is the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, why does Canelo Alvarez necessarily need to beat Dimitri Bivol and David Benavidez, two guys that are probably about 1.5 to 2 weight classes bigger than him? Yes, Canelo was fighting at the 168-pound weight class, but he's not a guy that really is a natural 175-pounder. When we talk about Julio Cesar Chavez, did Chavez beat, did he beat Oscar De La Hoya? Is that what happened when he was 33 years old? Did he beat the great up-and-coming young talent that clearly was taller and lengthier than him, and a guy that probably would have been quicker than him, and a guy that, overall would have been a great up-and-coming pound-for-pound talent? Is that what happened? Or did he end up getting stopped, I believe, within about 5 or something rounds? Salvador Sanchez, of course, was an all-time great level fighter as well, but he was only a one-weight division champion. That's why I can never say for certain that Salvador Sanchez, at least in my view, was the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. So who else is there really to compare? I mean, we talk about Juan Manuel Marquez. Juan Manuel Marquez is an all-time great level fighter, but he was never considered the number one pound-for-pound fighter of his day. He was never considered over guys like Floyd Mayweather. He was never considered over guys like a Manny Pacquiao. Two fighters that I would say probably had greater careers than Canelo Alvarez, but Juan Manuel Marquez was never the Canelo Alvarez of his day. And if we're comparing Juan Manuel Marquez and Canelo Alvarez, there are certain things in the ring that Canelo Alvarez can do that Juan Manuel Marquez cannot do. It is what it is, But the thing is that Paulie Malignaggi, when it comes to Canelo Alvarez, it's very apparent to me that this dude that, even though he likes to say for certain reasons that this is why he gives Canelo a hard time, no, he gives Canelo Alvarez a hard time because it's very clear that Paulie, that when you take a look at him, that first of all, he doesn't like people that he believes are either getting wrongful decisions or getting more credit than they deserve, or on top of that, PED cheats. And Paulie Malignaggi believes all those things with Canelo. And listen, what I'll state is this: there are 1 or 2 decisions in Canelo Alvarez's career that many people believe that he probably did not deserve. Now, in my personal view, when I rewatch those fights, at least with a logical state of mind, at least in the first Gennady Golovkin fight, Gennady Golovkin, even though I thought that he still edged that fight out to the slightest of degrees, if you had Canelo Alvarez having a draw within that fight, I could understand it. Because after rewatching that fight after so many years, when I was first watching that fight, I was not watching it with a logical eye. I was watching it with an eye hoping that Canelo Alvarez was really going to break Canelo Alvarez's neck. I did not like Canelo Alvarez as a fighter whatsoever. I was hoping that Gennady Golovkin was going to put Canelo Alvarez into retirement. And of course, that is not what ended up happening. But in the rematch, when I got a better sense of what Canelo was able to do in the ring, and Gennady Golovkin stating that he would not need to make any changes, I already knew that that was a mistake heading into the rematch, and I knew that Canelo was more than likely going to pull out of that rematch, because Canelo Alvarez was faster than the two fighters, and on top of that, there was just certain things that he could do that Gennady Golovkin could not do. And Gennady is a phenomenal level talent. He's a phenomenal level fighter. But Canelo was even better. And keep in mind that Canelo Alvarez, that he was a bit smaller than Gennady Golovkin. He weighed less, he had a shorter reach, he had shorter height, but Canelo Alvarez was still able to come out on top at the end of the day. And that's something that even certain other great fighters were not able to do when they moved up in weight. And overall, they finally fought that 50-50 level fight, and they were not able to win that fight. Canelo Alvarez was. Of course, against Lara, a lot of people thought he lost against Lara, but rewatching that fight many years later, it's still a fight that, in my view, could have won either way. But I can understand now why certain people believe that Canelo Alvarez rightfully deserved that decision. Because Lara, you can debate in certain rounds that, maybe he moved a little bit too much. I'm not going to say that he ran necessarily, but that at certain times that he did not throw quite enough as what he should have, which has always really been a major problem with both Araceli Lara and Guillermo Rigondeaux, some of the Cuban fighters that come from the very high class of defensive Cuban boxing school. It's been a little bit of a problem with them over time, but I can see why Canelo Alvarez maybe, possibly win that fight. Now, is there a little bit maybe of Canelo Alvarez having some favoritism over his career? Sure. But Canelo Alvarez is one of those fighters that they wanted to be destined to be an all-time great level fighter. And sure, it was somewhat within the script a little bit at the very beginning that Canelo would be looked at as an all-time great level fighter. But you still have to live up to that script. And when it comes to Paulie Malignaggi, he's very similar to an Isaiah Thomas whenever he talks about a Michael Jordan. For those of you that don't know who Isaiah Thomas is, Isaiah Thomas was the great point guard during the 80s and also the early 90s for that of the Detroit Bad Boy Pistons. For those of you that don't really remember, the 80s were pretty much dominated by that of the Larry Bird Boston Celtics and the Magic Johnson / Kareem Abdul-Jabbar LA Lakers. The Detroit Pistons would come out a little bit later on, and they would almost be kind of looked at as an eyesore to certain people because they kind of came out of nowhere and they were remembered for playing a very bad style of basketball, or at least a very thuggish style of basketball. To where, to be fair, they were very dirty. Well, the Detroit Pistons, of course, would eventually become two-time defending champions, and Michael Jordan was pretty much the new craze. He pretty much was that, of the new hype. And the Detroit Pistons felt that they were being a little bit overlooked, especially as the new champions, and that they were not getting the respect that they deserved. And the NBA clearly wanted Michael Jordan to take the mantle, and it created a lot of bitterness and hatred, I believe, within that of the Detroit Pistons. It created a chip on their shoulder, and on top of that, a wanting of Michael Jordan to never be the one to take that next step. And that's a lot of the times, why someone can become a hater, because, they don't believe that they're getting the credit that they deserve. And on top of that, overall, they believe that someone is getting an over amount of credit that they deserve. And it's Paulie Malignaggi is one of these fighters in his career to where I think he believes a little bit that he did not get quite the credit that he deserved in his career, or maybe that there were certain decisions that did not favor him or something like that. And Paulie Malignaggi is a guy that, even though a lot of the times I do think that he has some good analyzations or some good points, some of his points just go a little bit too far in my personal view. But, it's very similar, almost like when I take a look at it, to the Isaiah Thomas versus Michael Jordan situation, even though, of course, Paulie and Canelo Alvarez, they never fought. But, it's also very similar with Juan Manuel Marquez and Canelo Alvarez, where Juan Manuel Marquez, for whatever reason, like, this dude has, like, whenever he talks about Canelo Alvarez, you can clearly tell that there's some sort of discontent there. Like, he hates Canelo Alvarez with a pure passion whenever he talks about Canelo. And just because you criticize Canelo Alvarez doesn't mean necessarily that you hate him. There can be fair and just criticism. But whenever you talk about someone like a Paulie Malignaggi or a Juan Manuel Marquez, they clearly hate Canelo Alvarez for whatever particular reason. But I think that those are two fighters that believe that they did not get enough credit in their particular careers. And I think it's the same thing with that you see with Isaiah Thomas and the Chicago Bulls. And that's why it made it that much more infuriating for the Detroit Pistons when Michael Jordan would eventually become not only an NBA champion, but a multiple-time NBA champion and eventually the greatest of all time. Now that a certain amount of people are taking a look at Canelo Alvarez as debatably the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, they remember the fight that they thought that he lost against Lara and that they thought he lost against Golovkin, and they believe that he's getting an over amount of credit, and they personally believe that probably with certain experiences that they had experienced in life, that this is just another dude overall that is getting way more credit than what he actually deserves. Kind of like the Sugar Ray Leonard complex. Like, a lot of people don't remember, but Sugar Ray Leonard was remembered as a guy that, to a lot of people, that was really fed with a silver spoon. A lot of people were really cheering for Marvin Hagler within that fight against Sugar Ray Leonard because they thought that Marvin Hagler was a representation of the hardworking man that had to make it up to the top, all the way to the top by himself, and, bring himself up by his bootstraps. Where Sugar Ray Leonard pretty much was the golden child, and, he pretty much was the man that was destined to always be the golden child, and that he was gifted certain things. And sure, but at the end of the day, once again, Sugar Ray Leonard did prove to be the greatest fighter of that era. But I just thought that this was a very particularly interesting subject to talk about. But we're going to see what Paulie Malignaggi has to say about this recent fight with David Benavidez and David Morrell. And we're also going to see what he has to say about Canelo Alvarez. Let's get into it.
Last prediction, just because I realize the fight's coming up. Benavidez Morrell.
I'm gonna go with Benavidez, but I think it's a very tough fight. I think it's very tough. I think people are knocking, and maybe this fight did get made because Morrell looked a little susceptible against Hot Rod, and then against Vazdik. Maybe this fight did get made because he's looked a little bit susceptible, but I don't think this is an easy fight. I think that, maybe if Morrell looks really good and stops both Hot Rod and Vazdik, maybe this fight didn't get made, because a piece of me did think that Benavidez was giving Morrell a little bit of the treatment that Canelo was giving Benavidez. And this is what happens when at the very top.
Well, sure, David Benavidez, I mean, if you just want to say outright, he turned down the David Morrell fight, or he avoided David Morrell, if you really want to go there, I guess. But I can't really blame David Benavidez for not taking the David Morrell fight immediately. And Eddie Hearn, even though we all know that Eddie Hearn sometimes can have a little bit of a big mouth as well, Eddie Hearn made a very great point with David Benavidez. He said, if you're David Benavidez, or even Canelo Alvarez, why the hell would you want to fight someone like a David Morrell? He's huge for the 168-pound weight class. He doesn't really have that much experience. He has really not a great amount of facial recognition within the sport of boxing. It's not like he's super well known. These Cuban fighters oftentimes are very avoided because of that reason, because they're very high level risk, but very low reward. Like, you're not going to get as much of a payday for a potential ass whooping. So it's like, why the hell would you really want to fight one of those guys? And then on top of that, he doesn't have a belt. He doesn't really have that many fights. So even if you beat him, it's not like you're going to get that great amount of credit, at least, at that particular time frame. Now, David Morrell, I believe, has been, kind of given the WBA title because Artur Beterbiev, I believe, had to give up one of the belts. But, the thing is that back then, I can't really blame David Benavidez for turning down the fight. And I can't really blame certain boxers for turning down a fight, especially a very dangerous fight, when there's really nothing in it for them. Like, I remember when Marcos Maidana was criticized by certain guys that he, quote-unquote, ducked Keith one-time Thurman, but I believe at that time he took the Adrian Broner fight. Of course you'd rather take the Adrian Broner fight, because Adrian Broner at that time was a legit welterweight champion, and on top of that, Adrian Broner was looked at as the next upcoming Floyd Mayweather Jr., and of course we all know that that fight would eventually give him the Floyd Mayweather Jr. fight. So Marcos Maidana, it's like, of course you want to take the Adrian Broner fight. Why the hell would you want to take a fight against a very undefeated, young, dangerous contender in Keith one-time Thurman? If you lose to Keith one-time Thurman, it completely dismantles your career, and then on top of that, overall, once again, he's a guy that doesn't have a belt, doesn't really have that much facial recognition. Of course you're going to take Adrian Broner. But to be fair, maybe that was after the Floyd Mayweather Jr. loss. I don't know. But to be honest, I can't really criticize Maidana that much, because eventually, of course, he would get the opportunity against Adrian Broner and Floyd Mayweather.
Yeah, well, log jam, you create log jams all the way underneath you, and that's why I had it out for Canelo with this weight class, Yeah. But because now nobody wants to lose their position because they want to get a shot at you, right? So, but I think that Morrell may be looking a little susceptible, may have maybe led Benavidez soften up a little bit and made the fight. Benavidez is an ultra competitor. He's one of these guys. He's in his prime. He's young, so he wants to make these fights. You got to make these fights at this time when guys are hungry and young, right? So I love the fact this fight got made. And I think this fight's trickier than it may have first seemed. But I'm still going to lean to Benavidez. But I think it's a very, very tricky fight, and I think it's a good fight. Yeah. And I think the win.
I have David Benavidez winning this fight. We'll see what ends up happening. But like I said, I need to see something out of David Morrell that I've just not seen in his prior fights. Now, to be fair, I've not really watched every single fight of David Morrell's, but it's just kind of hard to judge because the sample size is really just so small. Now, I understand that he has a great amateur pedigree, but I mean, I've seen this story before to where people love to say all this shit about, oh, this guy has this great amateur pedigree, blah, 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 right? But I've seen fighters that have great experience in the professionals versus a guy that has great amateur pedigree. And I mean, oftentimes the great professional will pull out over the great amateur. Now, if you have, a rare case where a fighter has great amateur experience, but also great professional experience, maybe like someone like a Lomachenko eventually, or a Usyk, or a Andreas G. Ward, or, someone like that, or Roy Jones Jr., then okay, then maybe it can make a little bit of sense. Errol Spence Jr. or Gennady Golovkin, then okay. But, when people talk about these guys like, Andrade, even though he never fought shit, and they're like, oh, well, he has this great amateur pedigree. Right, that's great, but it's like, when he was going into the David Benavidez fight, it's like, right, but who did you ever fight in the pros that was going to prepare you for him? And we all seen what ended up happening. And on top of that, I've seen many amateur level guys not turn out to be shit when they finally fought that legit professional guy. Not saying that that's going to exactly happen with David Morrell, but like I said, we'll see because he hasn't really fought anybody.
Sure. He's going to get criticized either way for not dominating. That's the world we live in.
You think it's going to be
That's
close?
the world we live in.
You think it's going to be tight like that? Like,
I think it could be tight. Yeah, I think it could be competitive. I think it's a tricky fight. Yeah. I lean to Benavidez, but I think it's a tricky fight, and I think that both of them would be Canelo right now.
Wow, both.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm staying one step ahead of the Canelo Brigade from when they struggle to beat each other in this fight. And the Canelo Brigade will be like, oh, you see, they look this and no. They're struggling against each other because they both are better than Canelo.
Right.
So I'm going to put that out there.
You can tell this man is so fucking annoyed with Canelo Alvarez and both the Canelo Alvarez fan base. And listen, what I'll state is this. Canelo Alvarez is pretty much the perfect type of star that you want to have for boxing. So he's going to have a very, very, very big cult of personality. He's going to have a very big fan base. And I understand, to a degree that can be very obnoxious to listen to because it's almost basically the reason why they call it a cult of personality is because it's really like a cult. A big fan base is really like a cult. And Canelo Alvarez does have a very big cult. Just as Terrence Bud Crawford, just as I'm sure Usyk does now, just as Inoue does. Any exceptional level athlete, they're always going to have a certain cult of fans. It just is what it is. Meaning what? That if you say something critical, even if it's something that's somewhat justified, they're going to rush to their defense immediately, basically like they're their wife, or their kids, so I understand.
Right.
That being stated about Paulie Malignaggi, he has been hating on Canelo Alvarez now for the better part of a decade. So, if not over a decade. So, it is what it is. But what I will state is this. I'm not really quite sure, just taking a look at Canelo Alvarez within his last two fights, I'm not really quite sure if I would favor him over David Benavidez or David Morrell either at this point in time in his career. I think that maybe I would favor him over David Morrell, but David Benavidez, I just think that he would be a little bit too big. I think that he would be a little bit too athletic at this point in time in Canelo's career. I think that if this was the Canelo that I had seen maybe over Danny Jacobs or Caleb Plant, that I would probably favor Canelo over David Benavidez. But, I mean, the thing is that Canelo Alvarez, he's clearly getting older as a fighter. He's clearly getting slower. It is slower, excuse me. It is what it is. He looked visibly slower against both Jaime Munguia and Edgar Berlanga. And I don't think that it's really that debatable. I think that Canelo clearly is just not the same fighter. And when you talk about that, Canelo's a guy that really never that belonged that much at the 168-pound weight class in the first place. He's a guy that really is more of a natural middleweight. And even when he was first starting out at middleweight, he really was not as big as some of the guys there. Like, he was not as big as Danny Jacobs. He was not as big as Gennady Golovkin. So Canelo Alvarez is a guy that, because of his exceptional skill set, he's been able to do certain things that certain other great, professional boxers would not be able to do. Like, for example, let me actually talk about this. Because someone actually, talked about it in my comment section very recently. And they said, you said that Canelo's an all-time great level fighter, but I personally disagree. You said that he's debatably top 30 of all time, but I personally disagree. And they compared him to his favorite fighter in Tommy Hearns, and he said, I don't think that Canelo is greater than Tommy Hearns, and in my view, Tommy Hearns is not top 35 of all time. And I agree with you. Tommy Hearns is not top 35 of all time because Tommy Hearns never won his big fights. It just is what it is. Tommy Hearns ended up getting knocked out against Sugar Ray Leonard. He ended up getting knocked out against Marvin Hagler. Now, he did beat Wilfredo, Benitez, but Wilfredo Benitez was not really an all-time great level fighter. He was a very talented fighter, but he pretty much lost every big level fight in his career other than Roberto Duran. He lost to Tommy Hearns. He lost to Sugar Ray Leonard. He lost, pretty much a certain amount of other fights. It just is what it is. Wilfredo Benitez is a very good fighter, but I'm not sure if he was an all-time great level fighter. Very good fighter, but not all-time great level fighter. Then you talk about, also to, who the hell was the guy? Iran Barkley, that one super middleweight, I believe that he ended up losing to. Tommy Hearns was a great fighter, and he was an exceptional talent. But to be honest with you, there are certain boxers that end up, underachieving in their career, and then there are certain boxers that end up overachieving in their career. And when you talk about Canelo Alvarez has actually kind of overachieved in his career. When you talk about his size, for someone that if we're just going to compare him to Tommy Hearns, doesn't really have the same one-shot knockout power, doesn't really have the same hand speed, doesn't really have the same height and reach, really nowhere near as a Tommy Hearns. But yet he was able to become a champion in 4 different weight classes and actually beat certain top 10 level pound for pound talents. But the only 2 fights that he ever officially lost on paper was one when he was 23 years old and against the #1 pound for pound fighter when he probably did not have the same level of fight experience as that fighter. Now, don't get it twisted. Canelo, of course, did have 40-something fights or 30-something fights at that time when he fought Floyd Mayweather Jr. But what that was comparable to, like in my view, if we're going to compare it, that was kind of like if we're looking at it in tennis terms or like in football terms or in basketball terms. That was like when LeBron James, for example, like in 2007, when he fought against Tim Duncan and the San Antonio Spurs in the 2007 finals. Yes, LeBron James was still a great talent and he was still one of the top 5 players in the NBA, but he was not really at his peak yet. Now, was he a guy that, would be 10 times better later on than what he was at that time? No, probably not. But he was a guy that still would become better later on. Or like Michael Jordan when he was first up against the Detroit Pistons. Michael Jordan was still phenomenal, but he did not know how to win championship level basketball yet. And Canelo Alvarez was still learning how to win some of those bigger fights in his career, especially against some of those bigger, slicker fighters, or some of those slicker fighters, excuse me. So that's why I say, I give Canelo at least, I'm not going to say a complete pass, but, I say that, Canelo Alvarez, that I'm not really too hard on him for losing to Floyd Mayweather Jr. Because Floyd was looked at not only as just like it's not even like Floyd was a top 10 pound for pound fighter or something like that. Floyd was looked at as the #1 pound for pound guy. He was looked at as the clear #1 pound for pound fighter. And yes, he was 36 years old, but he was still looked at as being at the peak of his career or at the prime of his career. Like that would be like when Carlos Alcaraz first faced off against Novak Djokovic, in the French Open, when they had their first, Grand Slam meeting. And that's like me saying, oh, well, Carlos Alcaraz, he lost to a grandpa versus Novak Djokovic. Well, sure, Novak Djokovic was a bit older, but Novak Djokovic has been there and done that. He's a multiple-time Grand Slam champion. Like he's won, a couple dozen of Grand Slams. And on top of that, he's a dude that's very battle hardened. He's a guy that has been there. Sure, he has certain battle scars and maybe certain wear and tear, but he knows how to win certain things. He's under a little bit less pressure. And on top of that, he's a guy that just has more experience. That isn't his advantage. Now, of course, Alcaraz is the guy that is younger, maybe faster, maybe stronger at this point in time in his career, but he doesn't really know how to win as consistently yet. And that was the same thing with Canelo Alvarez. Canelo, of course, had been in a couple of championship level fights, but the only 50-50 fight that he ever was really in, or at least against a real top-tier talent, was really against Austin Trout before that. So I'm not discrediting Mayweather's win against Canelo Alvarez. It's still a great win. And Canelo, was still a great talent back then. It shows you the greatness of Mayweather, of what he was able to do to Canelo. And I do think that he's a greater fighter than, say that of Canelo, or a better skilled fighter. But the thing that people tried to say about Canelo back then, like, oh, he's just the exact same fighter as what he was back then. No, that's just not the case. When people say that shit, they're usually just hating. Because when people overall say it about other fighters, you notice that they don't say that they're the exact same fighters. Like, no one will tell you that Terrence Bud Crawford is the exact same fighter as what he was against Gamboa when he was losing the first half of that fight. No one says that Terrence Bud Crawford is the exact same fighter as what he was back then. Now, of course, Crawford, overall had never lost a fight, but Crawford has also never been in the same trenches as Canelo Alvarez. There's no offense. That's why it's so hard to judge side by side. Like, people say, oh, well, Crawford, he's never lost in his career, right? But when is Crawford, at 23 years old, only ever had one 50-50 level fight? Like, that would be like Terrence Bud Crawford if he fought Victor Postol and then immediately went up against Floyd Mayweather Jr. or the #1 pound for pound fighter. Someone that was actually comparable with height and reach, not someone that would be like a midget compared to him in Yuriorkis Gamboa. So like I said, that's how we kind of have to compare it to a certain degree.
That's what's up. That's what's up. Well, Paulie, appreciate you spending, I don't know, what was this, like 2 hours or whatever, however long we've been talking. Appreciate you.
Yeah, you gotta cut this one up, right?
Nah, bro. Listen, man, I miss these conversations. We gotta do this again for sure. Is there anything?
Catching up with you, bro.
You know,
Check out-
definitely. Is there anything you want to let the fans know before you do?
No, yeah, I
tune in
brought
to
up
Pro
where
Box?
I'm at Pro Box TV. You know, just don't say that you don't. It's a shame I'm not in the business. You know, be a fan of the business, and I follow Pro Box TV, man, because I think you guys will. I don't say it just because I work there. It's really a great place for boxing fans to subscribe to. You know, it's really an excellent place. I also do my own little personal thing as a hobby, Poli TV.
Yep.
I don't put out as much videos on Poli TV as I should. I get. You know, I'm not as much because it's more of a hobby than anything else. But every once in a while, I'll put out some Poli TV videos on YouTube, and you know, give my take on something, whether it's a fight or just something going on in boxing. You know,
Yeah.
I'll do that too.
That's what's up. That's what's up. Well, again, Paulie, I appreciate it.
But anyways, that pretty much is about it for this video. I just thought that that was very particularly interesting. But thank you all so much for watching. But I do agree with Paulie to a certain degree that I don't know if I would favor Canelo Alvarez over either David Morrell or that of a David Benavidez. First of all, they're just decently bigger than Canelo. I think that that's obvious. And then on top of that, you know, Canelo's just old. You know, like I said, Canelo Alvarez overall, when it comes down to it, the man is 34 years old. Yes, people take a look at that and they say, well, oh, that's not that old. You know, he's only 34 years old, right? But it's not always about how long you do something. You know, like I said, you know, it's about, you know, or it's not always about how old you are. It's about how long you do it or how much wear and tear you have. And like I said, just comparative, you know, just that one comment that I found to be very particularly interesting when he brought up Tommy Hearns comparative with Canelo, just my personal view, Tommy Hearns is not in the same breath as a Canelo Alvarez. Canelo was in the same breath, in my personal view, as certain guys, debatably like a Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker. And I realize that certain people are not going to like that, but it is what it is. You know, are there certain things that Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker probably does better than Canelo? Yes, but when we take a look at Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker comparatively, he ended up dominating Julio Cesar Chavez, of course, for his day, which was the great 50-50 level fight when they were comparative in size. But did Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker really beat Oscar De La Hoya? No, he didn't. You know, is he a guy that beat Felix Tito Trinidad? No, he didn't. You know, so, you know, it is what it is. But I mean, to be fair, a lot of people also believe that Pernell Sweet Pea Whitaker, that he beat Oscar De La Hoya. To be fair, Canelo Alvarez, I don't think that anyone would debate that he beat Dimitri Bivol. But that's why I say, you know, and Pernell's within my top 20 fighters of all time, somewhere around there. You know, so Canelo, you know, he maybe a little bit less than that. I don't know. But Canelo Alvarez, Crawford, and Usyk, that's why I say they're around that level. You know, they're around the top 30 to top, you know, overall, you know, 20 of all time for me. Now, of course, certain people have also asked me the question about how far do I go back in terms of ranking fighters. I pretty much go back around the Sugar Ray Robinson, Rocky Marciano, Joe Louis era. But it's a little bit hard for me to always rank that era because that era was filled with a bunch of fighters that oftentimes would fight guys that would be 32 and 22 or 16 and 11 or certain guys like that. And you would have tons and tons of fights like that. So it's a little bit hard to judge. But, you know, there are certain all-time great level fighters, you know, even from the older eras that I would count, you know, overall, such as like Henry Armstrong, Harry Greb, and, you know, overall Willie Pep and certain guys like that, Sugar Ray Robinson and those guys. There are certain older guys, maybe Jack Johnson, I don't know. But, you know, overall, I'd have to take a look at that. But in terms of just the modern era, when I talk about that, yeah, Canelo, in my view, he'd be around that top 30 of all time. If you have guys, you know, overall like Bernard Hopkins, Terrence Crawford, Usyk as all-time great level fighters, then you have to have Canelo up there as well, in my personal view. He's on that level. And when we talk about Tommy Hearns, just to compare him, Tommy Hearns, for the physical talent that he was, he definitely should have been the best fighter of his particular era. For a guy that was as physically talented as what he was more physically talented than Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, or Roberto Duran. He was more physically talented than any of those fighters. But yet he ended up losing almost every single big fight in his career. Canelo Alvarez, you can actually take a look in certain fights where he was not the more physically talented fighter, but, you know, because of his combined physical talent and his skill set and his boxing IQ, he was actually able to pull out of those A-grade level wins. Tommy Hearns, a lot of the times, he ended up underwhelming because his boxing IQ just was not all the way there. He had a very poor defense, and that's why oftentimes he ended up getting chinned against certain bigger, you know, name fighters, but it is what it is. But anyways, that pretty much is about it for today. Thank you all so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.